Let's talk about world building. It is a blast, but it can be pretty intimidating. There are tons of resources out there associated with D&D and otherwise that include step-by-step guides for building your own world from nothing. These guides that are independent of gaming are great for someone who is writing a sci-fi or a fantasy novel, but tend not to include the steps between making a setting cool and making a setting fun for your players. On the other hand, I have found resources that are D&D or TTRPG focused make a lot of assumptions that I think deserve at least a little consideration. Before we go any farther, let's get a few things out of the way. 1. You will never be done world building. The spaces between the fleshed out bits will just get a little smaller. Also, world building is exactly as hard as you want it to be, which I'll go into a little bit more detail about. One of the many decisions involved in this ambitious undertaking is how much of your content you will build from the ground up and how much of it you will adopt from other sources. The absolute minimum amount of work for you will look something like this. Your setting is a collage of other settings, adventure modules, and sourcebooks, which is completely acceptable, and how a lot of very successful DMs run their game. Once you start actually running your game, the world starts to uniquely evolve around the decisions you make when preparing the content and the decisions your players make when piloting their characters. So you all end up world building together anyway. I should also mention, using one's time effectively is a very important skill for a DM to have. If you have an hour and a half of free time per week for prepping, don't spend an hour of it writing an ode to a folk hero that died sometime in the second age of man. I mean, unless you really want to, but at that rate you'll have one session every 4 months. 10 out of 10 parties would prefer an adventure module set in the Forgotten Realms to an adventure that they can't play because you never finished writing it. On the other end of the amount of work for you spectrum is creating everything from a blank page. Almost all DMs will fall somewhere in between these two extremes, choosing to adopt things from other sources that they have no interest in building themselves. It is also common for a DM to use a system that they became familiar with during a campaign they played in as a player. For instance, several of my players who have gone on to run games for themselves have used my Pantheon just because it's what they know. I would be surprised if almost all DMs didn't, at least sometimes, use battle maps or towns that were created by other people, or by an online generator tool. Eventually, you will figure out what you enjoy making yourself and what you prefer to just copy and paste. Personally, I don't really like designing dungeons. I love designing the clues within them and the histories behind them, but the actual layout of the dungeon never really interests me. So I use random dungeon generators pretty often. I don't think it is necessary for you to build everything yourself. But I do think it is important for you to have built one of everything at least once. That way you've had a chance to ask yourself and then answer many of the big questions that go along with building each individual part of your world. Say one of your players who is rolling a new character really wants to owe a pact to the blood god, but you don't have a blood god. Does your pantheon have room to shoehorn in another god? Are there esoteric deities that only a few people know about? Can a new god be born if enough people believe in them, or if they complete the right ritual? And if gods can be born, can they be killed? These are questions that, if you just copied and pasted a pantheon, you may have never considered. Just having thought about these things once can be a great help as you concentrate on the things that you want to spend your time building. It is for this reason that this new video series, Worldbuilding Praxis, exists. Starting with a blank page and a fresh OneNote, I am going to build a world from the ground up, doing everything at least once. All while talking about things I have learned in my 3 previous world building journeys. I'll also include a shorter edited video like this where I'll talk about the concepts I'm using in each step, so you can do them for yourself. Alright, intro over, let's get to step 0. Remember, our end goal when world building for D&D is a setting in which our adventures and campaigns can take place. I know I've said it a few times already, but this is easy to forget and important to remember. I also want to avoid summarizing the Dungeon Master's Guide in my videos, but I do believe that every DM should read through it. Not necessarily cover to cover, but I think you should at least read through the first chapter, which is 29 pages with lots of pictures. The rest of the book is a worthwhile read as well, but for these first few videos, the first chapter should be sufficient. As per the Dungeon Master's Guide, the first step to world building after establishing your core assumptions is to create your pantheon, or the gods and deities of your world. But I am going to add a step 0 that comes before that. It should be noted that what we are doing in step 0, you will never tell your players. You will never show your players, and your players will never suss out. I'm working on an inspiration video that'll go into this a little bit deeper, but there are some things your players don't want to know. They might think they want to know, but they don't. Parting the curtain too far can take away some of the wonder of the world that you are building. So, this step is only for you. Step 0 is establishing your fundamental forces. We have 4 fundamental forces in our reality, but that's not what I'm talking about. We are going to create some fantasy fundamental forces that exist separately from the sciencey ones. These fundamental forces will dictate a few things: the deities in our pantheon, the organization of our planar system, and any other big magic or interplanar stuff that crops up along the way. These forces don't have to be logically sound. They can be downright silly. They just have to make sense to you. Why are we doing this? First and foremost, it's faster than the alternative. What this step will give us is a basic framework and roadmap for our pantheon and planar system. This step is not strictly necessary, but I do suggest it. I have created a pantheon from nothing with no roadmap, and it took a while. I have also created a planar system from nothing by just drawing and moving shapes around, which also took a very long time. This method, I have found, is a lot faster, and the quality of the end products is the same or better. It will also expedite 3 or 4 of our future world building steps, so I think it's worth it. Plus, we'll have a basic structure to fall back on if somewhere down the line we have any big questions about the themes of our setting or the adventures and campaigns that take place in it. To create our fundamental forces, the easiest and fastest thing to do is to base them on an existing system. Now, what do I mean by system? I just mean any group of things that interact with each other and function as a larger whole. Your forces can be based on any system you'd like, but it should be something that you're familiar with, and it should have at least 3 or 4 individual parts or elements. It could be something that exists in nature, like the phases of the moon, the seasons, or the life cycle of a star. Or you could use something a little more conceptual, like how your pets interact with each other, or what I'll be using for praxis, a piece of music, which is what I suggest you do as well. I don't mean base it on a piece of music, I mean base it on something that you enjoy, some other hobby of yours that you understand and would spend time on anyway. I would also suggest being able to put your forces and phases on some kind of diagram or chart. It is a big help to base your forces on a system that already has some form of notation. In the case of praxis, sheet music. After we've got our forces, we will also denote phases, or how the system changes over time. In each subsequent phase, the interactions between the forces will be slightly different. In short, we are making a table with our forces on one axis and our phases on the other. Your organizer can look like this, or it can look totally different. It doesn't have to be a 2-axis table. I have used a 3-dimensional Cartesian space where the positive and negative regions of each axis are diametrically opposed fundamental forces. This was a ton of fun, but it took a really long time. For praxis, we're going to keep things a little simpler. We're then going to go through and slap some alignments down on our organizer that we think makes sense. Regardless of your opinions on alignment, and whether or not they should even be included on a character sheet, I think it does make sense for the gods to have them. At least in my games, deities function as ideals incarnate, so the unidimensionality of the alignment system has never really been a problem. Now we've got 3 qualities: the force, the phase, and the alignment, to give us ideas for each deity, which we will fill in next time in step 1. The amount of time you want to spend thinking about your fundamental forces is up to you. It could be 5 minutes or 5 days. But the end product should have these qualities. The elements of your system need to interact with each other. The ways in which they interact is going to help us later on when we are designing our planar system. Your diagram or organizer should include the flow of time, whether it's in the form of your phases or a cycle of some kind. This can be as ambiguous as you would like, but having some sort of repeating pattern is going to be very helpful to us later on. If you are having trouble thinking of something, that's totally fine. When starting out on a big project like this, I like to take a few days to just think. Go to class, go to work, live your life, but spend 5 minutes here and 10 minutes there just letting your mind wander. Eventually, something will probably come to you. If this all sounds wacky and overly ambiguous, good. This step, especially, is supposed to. And don't worry, that's what the video series is for. You will be able to watch me do all of these steps in Worldbuilding Praxis Episode 0. Thanks for watching, everybody. Worldbuilding Praxis Episode 0 is up, but unlisted. It's set to drop in a few days, mostly just so the algorithm doesn't get mad at me. If you want to support the channel, you can like, subscribe, and all that stuff, or you can head over to the DMs Guild and check out Principles of Shamanism. See ya.